The universe had forgotten the veil, or perhaps, more accurately, it had chosen to. It was a wound in the fabric of space, a sprawling nebula of radioactive dust and shattered planetoids where stars went to die. No sane pilot charted a course through its swirling, toxic clouds. There was nothing to find here but ghosts and interference for the men and women condemned to its service. It was not a place, but a sentence. A slow-motion execution measured in work shifts and rationed oxygen. They called the largest of their mining outposts the Rust, a name earned by the perpetual red-brown film that coated every surface. A fine powdered ground from the asteroid's iron-rich core that worked its way into lungs, joints, and machinery with equal, unforgiving persistence. Life on the Rust was a low, mechanical hum, the endless groan of ore processors, and the hiss of recycled air. They were debt harvesters, a sanitized term coined by the consortium for its disposable workforce. They mined ethel, a crystalline element that glowed with a soft, blue light and possessed the miraculous quality of extending the lives of the wealthy citizens back in the core worlds. For the harvesters, however, it only extended their debt. Kalen tasted iron as he worked, the familiar flavor of his own blood mixed with the ever-present dust. He was wedged deep in the guts of the primary atmospheric converter, his knuckles scraped raw against the corroded housing. A pressure seal had blown, and the air in Sector Gamma had taken on the thin, metallic tang that preceded total life support failure. Alarms blared, a monotonous, ignored shriek that had become the soundtrack to their lives. The others had panicked, a frantic scramble of bodies in the narrow corridors, but Kalen moved with a weary resignation. Panic was a luxury, a waste of oxygen. He found the cracked gasket. Its synthetic material hardened and split like old leather. He remembered a time when he commanded a ship where components like this were replaced quarterly as a matter of course. Here, they were patched with sealant and prayers until they gave out, taking a few lives with them as a final, spiteful act. He worked the worn hydrospanner, his muscles screaming in the cramped space, his mind a quiet, gray fog. He preferred it that way. Thought led to memory, and memory was a razor. He had been a pilot once, a damn good one, captain of the Stray Dog, a consortium freight hauler with a crew that had been more family than colleagues. He remembered the fierce loyalty in their eyes, the easy laughter in the mess hall, the shared dream of one day buying their contracts and finding a quiet moon to call home. He also remembered the look of betrayal on his first mate's face as consortium enforcers stormed the bridge, the clean, sterile pop of their pulse rifles, the blood floating in zero-G like crimson jewels. His mutiny had been a fool's gambit, a desperate play for freedom that had cost him everything and everyone. The consortium hadn't killed him. Death was too kind. They had broken his rank, scrubbed his identity, and sentenced him to the Veil, to live out his days as a ghost among ghosts, haunted by the faces of the dead. He tightened the last bolt, the pressure gauge needle flickering from red to a steady, hopeful amber. The alarms sputtered into silence. He didn't feel relief, only a hollow echo of accomplishment. He had bought them another day, another rotation of breathing, working, and forgetting. As he slid out of the tight maintenance shaft, the station's power flickered. The main lights died, plunging the corridor into the eerie twilight of emergency strobes. Then came the sound. It wasn't the familiar groan of failing machinery. It was a low, pervasive thrum, that vibrated through the deck plates. A discordant chord that seemed to worm its way directly into his skull. The emergency lights pulsed in time with it, casting long, dancing shadows. On the main concourse, harvesters froze, their faces pale and confused in the rhythmic darkness. The thrum grew, layered with something else, a crackling, whispering static that bled through the station's internal comms. It wasn't a language, not words, but it felt structured, intentional, a pattern hidden in chaos. Kalen's pilot instinct screamed that this was wrong. This wasn't a power surge or a systems failure. This was something external, something trying to get in. The main ore conveyor, a massive magnetic track that snaked through the heart of the rust, suddenly reversed polarity. A multi-ton chunk of raw ethel, suspended halfway to the processors, shot backward with catastrophic force. It slammed into a structural support pylon, and the world became a symphony of screaming metal. The deck buckled, throwing Kalen against a bulkhead. Dust and debris filled the air, and for the first time in years, real, genuine panic erupted. People ran, trampling each other in a desperate flight to the sealed blast doors of the residential blocks. Kalen saw a young boy go down, his mother's scream swallowed by the chaos. He started to move, to help, but the old Kalen, the captain, was buried too deep. He was just a mechanic, just a survivor. He pushed himself toward the nearest tool locker, his mind already calculating the damage, the necessary repairs, the price of survival. That's when he saw her. Amid the swirling dust and flashing strobes, a young woman stood perfectly still. She couldn't have been more than 20. With a gaunt face framed by strands of dark hair, her harvester jumpsuit hanging loosely on her thin frame. While everyone else was running from the chaos, she was staring directly at the source of it, at the mangled wreckage of the conveyor. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of intense concentration, almost reverence. Her name was Ilara. He knew her only by reputation. A null. The others called her. Most harvesters, after years of exposure, developed a dullness, a mental fog from the low-level psychometric field the ethel crystals emitted. It was a subtle, pacifying effect the consortium found beneficial, but a few, the nulls, were immune. They remained sharp, but often became strange, prone to muttering, to staring into the blackness of space for hours. They were seen as damaged goods, outcasts in a society of outcasts. As Kalen watched, Ilara knelt down, oblivious to the groaning superstructure and the terrified screams around her. She began tracing patterns in the thick layer of rust on the floor with her finger. They were intricate, geometric shapes, full of sharp angles and repeating spirals. They looked like star charts, but for a galaxy he didn't recognize. The thrumming sound from the comms pulsed again, a sharp burst of static, and as it did, her hand moved faster, her lines becoming more complex, more urgent. It was as if she wasn't just hearing the sound, but transcribing it. A cold dread, something colder even than the vacuum of space you're washed over Kalen. This wasn't random. This was a conversation. The arrival of Warden Vorlog and his enforcers was as subtle as a hull breach. Their heavy-booted steps echoed down the corridor, a metronome of brutal authority. Vorlag was a mountain of a man, his face a road map of scars, his consortium uniform stretched tight over augmented muscle. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the chaos with cold disgust. His enforcers, clad in matte black armor and helmets that concealed any hint of humanity, fanned out, their pulse rifles held at a low, ready position. They weren't here to help. They were here to restore order. Production halt is unauthorized. Vorlag's voice boomed, amplified by his helmet. It was a voice that promised pain. Damages will be deducted from communal rations. Find me the cause. His eyes landed on the wreckage, then swept over the cowering harvesters until they settled on Ilara. Still kneeling, still drawing her impossible maps, Vorlag strode toward her, his boots crunching on flakes of rust. "You," he growled. "Null. What is this?" Ilara didn't look up, her fingers still moving. "It's a voice," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the station's groans. "It's showing me the way." Vorlag's face tightened. He clearly knew of the signal, and he was terrified of it. "There is no voice," he hissed, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. The half-finished pattern lay on the floor, a cryptic message in the dust. "There is only noise, malfunctions, delusions." He shoved her toward one of his enforcers. "Take her to the sanitizer. Full cycle. Erase this nonsense." The word sent a tremor of fear through the crowd. The sanitizer was a re-education tool, a polite term for a machine that burned memories and personality from a person's mind, leaving behind a compliant, empty shell. It was a fate worse than death. The enforcer dragged a now struggling Ilara away. As she passed Kalen, her eyes met his for a split second. In them, he didn't see madness. He saw a terrifying clarity and a silent, desperate plea. For the next few hours, Kalen did what he did best. He vanished into the work. He helped a small crew stabilize the damaged pylon with magnetic clamps and jury-rigged power conduits. He bypassed the wrecked conveyor controls, rerouting power to the secondary lifters. He lost himself in the familiar language of mechanics and engineering, a world where problems had logical solutions. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ilara's face and the patterns she had drawn in the dust. He had heard the signal too, felt it resonate in his bones. It wasn't a delusion, and the consortium's violent, fearful reaction only confirmed it. They were trying to suppress something they didn't understand and couldn't control. Later, when his shift was over, he didn't go to his small, coffin-like bunk in the residential block. An impulse he hadn't felt in years, a dangerous spark of curiosity, guided his feet. He made his way to the far end of the station, to the old comms relay tower. It had been decommissioned decades ago, a relic from the first prospectors who had settled. The rust before the consortium had absorbed everything. The place was a graveyard of obsolete technology, thick with the silence of the void. He found her there, not Ilara, but her work. On a dusty or forgotten console screen, someone had been trying to map the signal. Dozens of stellar charts were overlaid with the same geometric patterns she had drawn on the floor. It was a navigational plot, a complex and brilliant piece of astrogation that used pulsars and nebular drift as waypoints. It was a route, a path leading from their forgotten corner of the Veil through the most hazardous, unsurveyed sectors and out into the wider galaxy. It was a map to freedom. He heard a noise behind him and spun around, instinctively reaching for the heavy wrench at his belt. Ilara stood in the doorway, her face bruised, one arm held stiffly at her side. "I got away," she said, her voice a strained whisper. The enforcer, he was distracted. The signal came through again, stronger. It overloaded his helmet's audio filter. He started screaming. She looked past Kalen at the console. You see it, don't you? He could only nod, his throat dry. It's not just a map out, she continued, her eyes alight with a feverish intensity. It's an invitation. Something is waiting for us. Something that isn't the consortium. Before he could process her words, the hatch to the relay tower hissed open. Warden Vorlag stood there, flanked by 4 enforcers, their pulse rifles leveled. There was no escape. Such a disappointment, Vorlag said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He wasn't looking at Alara. He was looking at Kalen. I read your file, Captain, the hero of the stray dog mutiny. I truly thought we had broken that pathetic spirit of yours. I see now we need to be more thorough. He gestured to Alara. Bring me the null, and bring him the sanitizer chair. We'll start with him. Let's see if he can find any heroic last words after we scoop his brain out. The enforcers advanced, their methodical steps echoing in the small room. Kalen looked at Alara, at the impossible map on the screen, at the impassive black helmets of the men coming to erase him. The memory of his first mate's dying gasp filled his ears. He had failed his crew, failed his promise of freedom. He had run from that failure, hidden from it in the dust and grime of the rust. But here it was again, a choice. Let them take this girl, this last, insane glimmer of hope, and be erased, or fight the ghost of the man he once was, stirred in the ashes of his cynicism. He grabbed the heavy chastile wrench from his belt, its weight a familiar, solid promise in his hand. His quiet retirement was over. As the first enforcer raised his rifle, Kalen moved, not with the weary shuffle of a harvester, but with the explosive, desperate speed of a captain who had just been given a reason to go down with the ship. The universe compressed into the space of a single, ragged breath. For a decade, Kalen had been a creature of reaction, his spirit ground down to the simple mechanics of survival. But the cold weight of the wrench in his hand felt like a memory, an anchor to a man who once made choices that mattered. The first enforcer moved with practiced, efficient brutality, bringing his pulse rifle up. Kalen didn't aim for the armor, he aimed for the world the enforcer saw. He flung the heavy steel wrench in a low, spinning arc. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was a perfect one. The wrench slammed into the enforcer's helmet with a sickening crack of reinforced plasteel. The man stumbled back, his rifle discharging a bolt of searing plasma that gouged a molten trench in the ceiling. He was blind, disoriented, a stunned animal. Kalen was on him in an instant, not with a captain's strategy, but with the raw fury of a cornered man. He drove his shoulder into the enforcer's chest, using the man's own armored bulk to send them both crashing into a rack of decaying server blades. The rack toppled like a metal domino, pinning the enforcer beneath a cascade of sparking, obsolete electronics. Vorlag roared in frustration, a sound of pure offense that such a low life would dare to resist. Subdue him. I want him conscious for the chair. The remaining 3 enforcers converged, their movements a tight, disciplined triangle of death. Kalen knew he wouldn't get a second lucky shot. This was it. But then, Alara acted. She didn't scream or run. She closed her eyes, her bruised face a mask of serene focus, and reached out with her mind. The low thrum that had preceded the station's chaos returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper in the static. It was a shriek. It funneled into the small comms room, a focused wave of psychic noise that hammered against the Enforcers' high-tech helmets. Their comms went dead, replaced by a deafening squall. Their tactical HUDs flickered, filled with the ghost images of Ilara's star charts. They were deaf and blind, their senses hijacked. One of the Enforcers clutched his helmet, staggering as if struck. Kalen didn't waste the opening. He ripped a thick power conduit from the wall, ignoring the jolt of current that made his teeth ache, and swung it like a club. The cable, sparking and spitting, wrapped around the staggering Enforcer's legs. The man went down hard. Kalen saw his chance for a real weapon. He lunged for the fallen Enforcer's rifle, his fingers closing around the cold, unfamiliar stock, just as the third Enforcer regained enough sense to aim his own weapon. A plasma bolt seared the air where Kalen's head had been a second before. He rolled, came up on one knee, and fired. He had never been a soldier, but he had spent enough time in pirate-infested space to know how to handle a rifle. The shot was clumsy, wild, but it struck the Enforcer in the unarmored joint of his shoulder. The man screamed, a real human sound of pain that was shocking after the faceless silence of the helmets. Vorlag, seeing his unit fall apart, finally moved. He drew a heavy, brutal-looking shock maul from his back. It crackled to life with contained lightning. "Incompetent fools," he snarled, stepping over the writhing form of his injured man. "I'll peel the skin from your bones myself." "Captain." Kalen scrambled backward, dragging Ilara with him. She was pale, a trickle of blood leaking from her nose, the mental effort having taken a severe toll. "The wall!" she gasped, pointing a trembling finger at a section of the relay tower's rear bulkhead that looked as solid as the rest. "Behind the panel, there's a shaft." There was no time to question it. As Vorlag charged, his maul swinging in a deadly arc, Kalen fired a final, desperate shot not at the warden, but at the ceiling directly above him. The aging support beam, already fractured from the earlier plasma blast, gave way. A shower of metal struts and insulation rained down. Not enough to stop Vorlag, but enough to make him pause. In that moment of hesitation, Kalen kicked the rusted maintenance panel Ilara had indicated. It flew inward, revealing a dark, narrow void. A decommissioned ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for one person. "Go!" he yelled, shoving Ilara toward the opening. She squeezed through without a word. Kalen fired one more covering shot before diving in after her, the heat of Vorlag's enraged roar washing over his back. The shaft was a claustrophobic hell of rust and darkness, slick with decades of chemical condensation. They slid and scrambled downward, the sound of their descent echoing in the tight space. Behind them, they could hear the furious clang of Vorlag's maul against the shaft's opening. He was too large to follow, but the entire station was now his weapon. A klaxon began to blare, a new, more urgent alarm that vibrated through the metal around them. "Attention all harvesters!" Vorlag's voice echoed, distorted and tinny through the station's PA system. "Fugitives identified. The null designated Ilara, and the saboteur Kalen. A bounty is issued. Their capture will result in a full cycle's ration bonus. Harboring them will result in summary sanitation." Kalen's heart sank. Vorlag hadn't just made them fugitives. He had turned every hungry but desperate soul on the Rust into a potential enemy. They were trapped in a cage with 1,000 starving rats, and the warden was holding the cheese. "Where are we going?" Kalen whispered, his voice hoarse. They had reached a horizontal junction, a maze of intersecting shafts. Elara, despite her exhaustion, seemed certain. Down, away from the main conduits. The voice, it's quieter here, but clearer. It feels safe. She led him through a labyrinth of forgotten service tunnels and pressure equalization chambers, a hidden circulatory system beneath the station's skin. They moved through areas Kalen, in his decade of service, never knew existed. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant water. This was the underbelly, the parts of the station that had been abandoned and left to rot. After what felt like hours, Elara stopped. She pressed her hand against a solid-looking wall of corroded plasteel. "Here," she breathed. She pointed to a barely visible seam. Kalen pried at it with the tip of the captured pulse rifle. With a groan of protest, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dimly lit space beyond. It was a workshop, a scavenger's nest cobbled together from the bones of discarded technology. Racks of carefully organized components lined the walls. A medical diagnostic bed, patched and rewired, hummed softly in one corner, and in the center of it all, a man with a face like a worn leather glove looked up from the delicate circuitry he was soldering, his one good eye narrowing with suspicion. "You're either very brave or very stupid to be making this much noise," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "And you're bleeding on my floor." His name was Reese. He was a relic, one of the few harvesters who had been born on the rust before the consortium had clamped down. A man who knew the station's secrets because he had grown up inside them. He was a scavenger, a black market medic, a ghost who survived in the margins. He listened to Kalen's story with a cynical patience, his gaze flickering between the captured rifle in Kalen's hands and the exhausted, blood-stained girl leaning against the wall. "Vorlag has put a bounty on you," Reese stated, not as a question. "A whole cycle's rations. Do you know how many people on this rock would sell their own mother for a week's worth of protein paste?" Kalen met his gaze. "We're not asking you to fight him. We need a place to lie low. And we need information." Reese let out a short, humorless laugh. "Information is currency, Captain. And from the look of it, you're broke." Kalen gestured to the rifle. "This is a Series 7 Enforcer model. Its power cell is worth more than a month's rations. The targeting optics are worth too. You can have it. We just need a few hours." Reese considered it, his good eye scrutinizing them. He was a survivor, and survivors understood leverage. "Keep the rifle for now," he finally said. "You look like you'll need it more than I do, but the power cell is mine. And you tell me everything you know about that signal." While Reese tended to Elara's arm, dressing the bruises from the Enforcer's rough handling, Kalen explained what little he knew. He spoke of the map, the patterns, the feeling of intent behind the static. Elara, now lucid and sipping a cup of recycled water, added her part. "It's a consciousness," she said, her voice stronger now. "It's been broadcasting for a long time. But the ethel, it's like an amplifier. Most people, the ethel dulls their minds, makes them fuzzy. But for nulls, our minds are different. The dampening field doesn't work. We hear the static between the channels. And this signal, it's a beacon in that static. It's calling out to anyone who can hear, offering a way out." Reese leaned back, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "A way out," he mused. a flicker of something ancient and tired in his eye. People have been looking for a way out of this place since the first chunk of rock was carved. There is no way out. There's only the consortium. This map says otherwise. Kalen insisted. It's a viable route, complex, dangerous, but it's real astrogation. Reese shook his head slowly. A map is useless without a ship. Captain, and Vorlag has locked this station down tighter than a coffin. Every docking bay is under guard. Every transport is cataloged. Nothing gets in or out without his direct authorization. He's sweeping the residential blocks now, section by section, taking people to the sanitizer for questioning. He's not just hunting you, he's making an example of you. He's reminding everyone what hope gets them. A heavy silence filled the small workshop. The distant, rhythmic stomp of an enforcer patrol echoed down a nearby corridor, a reminder of their shrinking world. The hope that had flared in the comms tower was guttering, threatening to die in this dark, hidden hole. Kalen looked at the pulse rifle in his hands, at Ilara's fierce, desperate eyes. They had fought their way out of a trap, only to find themselves in a larger one. There has to be something, Kalen said, the words tasting like ash. Some forgotten access port, a maintenance drone, anything. Reese was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. He seemed to be weighing a lifetime of carefully cultivated cynicism against the smallest, most dangerous spark of possibility. There is one place, he said finally, his voice low, as if he were afraid to even speak the words aloud. A place even Vorlag's men don't go. Not a drone, a ship, or what's left of one. He looked directly at Kalen, and a look of grim understanding passed between them. Docking Bay 7, the graveyard. They left your old ship there. Captain, the stray dog. They left it to rot as a monument to your failure. Most of it's been stripped for parts over the years. But the frame, the reactor core, they're still there. It's a ghost. A tomb. Kalen felt the blood drain from his face. The stray dog. The name was a wound that had never healed. To go back to it, to walk its dead corridors, it was unthinkable. But as he looked at Ilara, who was watching him with an unwavering, almost psychic intensity, he knew Reese was right. It wasn't just a chance. It was the only chance. The ultimate irony. The tomb the consortium had built for his legacy might be the only cradle that could carry them to freedom. How do we get there? Kalen asked, the ghost of a captain finally, fully, taking command. The hunt was over. The mutiny had begun again. The plan, as Reese laid it out on a grimy schematic he'd etched onto a sheet of salvaged metal, was a special kind of suicide. There would be no walking through corridors, no slicing through sealed hatches. Their route was a cancerous crawl through the station's forgotten anatomy. He called it the guts. A network of unpressurized, zero-gravity mining shafts bored into the asteroid's core long before the rust was anything more than a prospector's wild dream. They were unstable, uncharted, and, most importantly, completely off the consortium's grid. Vorlag thinks in terms of sectors and pressure seals, Reese explained, his voice a low conspiracy in the humming workshop. He'd never consider a path that requires you to wear a vacuum suit for the better part of a day. It's too primitive, too dirty. He produced 3 patched-up, ancient-looking EVA suits from a hidden compartment, their fabrics stiff and smelling of ozone and desperation. The helmets had hairline fractures sealed with epoxy, and the oxygen recyclers were a cobbled-together mess of consortium and pre-consortium tech. These are noisy, they leak, and the comms are shot, Reese said with a grim satisfaction. But they'll keep the vacuum from boiling your blood. Mostly. He tossed Kalen a small, heavy pack. Mag boots, a line launcher, and 3 spare O2 tanks. That's all I can give you. The rest is up to you, Captain. The title felt like a mockery, a ghost haunting the cramped space. But looking at the suits, at Ilara's determined face as she checked the seals on her helmet, Kalen knew the ghost was all he had left to offer. Their entrance to the guts was a jagged, tooth-lined hole in the floor of a waste reclamation unit, hidden beneath a mountain of solidified refuse. The moment they dropped through, the world changed. The station's low, artificial gravity vanished, leaving them floating in a disorienting darkness. The familiar hum of machinery was replaced by a profound, unnerving silence, broken only by the hiss of their own breathing and the metallic clang of their mag boots finding purchase on the tunnel walls. The air in their suits was cold, recycled, and carried the faint, sterile tang of their own fear. They were no longer in a station. They were in a cave carved through the heart of a dead rock, hurtling through the void. Reese had been right. This place was a forgotten wound. The tunnels were a chaotic tangle, branching and twisting with no apparent logic. Some were wide enough to fly a maintenance drone through. Others were so narrow they had to squeeze through sideways, their packs scraping against the raw, iron-flecked stone. Frozen pockets of primordial ice glittered in the beams of their helmet lamps, ancient and beautiful in the absolute dark. The journey began to work on Kalen. The isolation and the rhythmic hiss of his own breath creating a hypnotic state. He was a pilot again, adrift in the black, but without a ship to command. His mind drifted to the one he had lost. He saw the bridge of the stray dog, not as a wreck, but as it was, warm, alive. He saw Jorik, his first mate, a big man with a booming laugh and eyes that crinkled at the corners, leaning back in his chair, a steaming mug of synth coffee in his hand. One more run. Cap. Jorik's voice echoed in his memory, as clear as if he were on the suit's deadcoms. One more. And we buy that moon in the Elysian system. No more consortium regs. No more debt halls. Just blue skies and real dirt. The memory was so vivid, so painful, it made Kalen's chest ache. He faltered, his mag boots slipping on a patch of slick ice. He would have tumbled into the darkness of a side shaft if not for a hand grabbing his arm. It was Ilara. Through her helmet, her eyes were wide, and in them he saw not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. She couldn't hear his thoughts, but she could feel the shape of his grief, a psychic wound as real and raw as any physical injury. She didn't speak, just squeezed his arm once before letting go. A silent message of solidarity that meant more than any words could. Their first true obstacle was a chasm, a massive, internal explosion from a forgotten mining charge had ripped the tunnel in two, leaving a yawning gap of blackness nearly 50 meters across. On the other side, the tunnel continued. Below, there was only a vertiginous drop into the asteroid's unmapped core. The line launcher, Reese's voice crackled in Kalen's memory. A phantom instructor. Aim for a solid-looking outcrop. Account for the lack of gravity. Don't miss. Kalen unslung the launcher. It was a crude, powerful tool. He aimed, his breath held tight in his chest, and fired. A grappling hook attached to a high-tensile wire shot across the void with a nearly silent thwump. It struck an iron deposit on the far side, the claws biting deep. He tugged on the line, testing it. It held. "I'll go first," he said, his voice muffled in his helmet. "Secure the line. Ilara, you're next. Reese gave us clamps. Just clip on and pull yourself across. Don't look down." He attached his harness to the wire and pushed off the edge. For a terrifying minute, he was a spider on a thread, dangling over nothingness. The silence of the void pressed in, absolute and indifferent. The only thing that mattered was the line in his hands, the burn in his muscles, and the two lives waiting on the other side. He reached the far ledge, his arms trembling with exertion, and hammered a piton into the rock, securing the line. He gave it 3 sharp tugs, the signal for Ilara to come across. She moved with a surprising grace, her thin frame pulling her along the wire with a steady, determined rhythm. She wasn't just a visionary, she was a survivor, as tough as the corroded metal of the station she'd been born into. As they ventured deeper, they had to pass close to the breather network, a series of pressurized maintenance junctions that linked the guts to the main station. It was a risk, but the only way forward. As they approached one junction, the silence was broken by voices, faint and distorted through the rock. Kalen signaled for a halt, and they extinguished their lights, pressing themselves into the shadows of a rockfall. Through a small, grime-caked viewport, they could see into a cramped, brightly lit corridor of the main station. 2 harvesters, their faces skeletal with hunger, were arguing with a pair of enforcers. "We know he was here," one of the harvesters pleaded, his voice thin with desperation. "Old Reese, the scavenger, the null girl, and the saboteur, they would have gone to him. We'll show you his hole-up. Just give us the rations. Please." The lead enforcer didn't even look at him. He simply raised his pulse rifle and fired a single, clean shot through the man's chest. The other harvester screamed and tried to run, but the second enforcer was on him in a flash, slamming him against the wall with a brutal efficiency. "Warden's orders." The enforcer's voice crackled through the viewport, devoid of any emotion. "Failure to provide useful intelligence is the same as harboring. Take him to sanitation." They dragged the screaming man away, leaving the corpse of his friend on the cold metal floor. Kalen felt a wave of nausea. This was the world they were trying to escape. A world that fed on its own, where desperation was a weapon turned inward. Ilara grabbed his hand, her own trembling slightly. The beacon she followed wasn't just a path to a place. It was an escape from a sickness. The constant proximity to the asteroid's ethyl-laced core was beginning to take its toll on Ilara. The signal, which had been a clear, guiding whisper, was now a roaring chorus in her mind. Several times she stumbled, clutching her helmet as if to block out the noise. "It's too much," she managed to gasp during a brief rest stop in a stable cavern. "It's not one voice, it's hundreds, all broadcasting on the same frequency. The map is a consensus, a path agreed upon by all of them. But listening to all of them at once, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose." She was burning out. Kalen knew they didn't have much time. He made her drink from their limited water supply and forced a nutrient paste into her hand. "Block them out," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Don't listen to the chorus. Just find one voice, the clearest one, and hold on to it. Like a single star in the dark. Navigate by that one." She looked at him, her eyes grateful, and nodded, closing her own. She was the navigator, but he was the captain. It was his job to keep his crew focused, to keep them from breaking. It was a role he hadn't played in a decade, but it fit like a well-worn glove. Their path began to change. The raw, jagged tunnels of the guts gave way to smoother, consortium-board access ways, sealed with emergency hatches that had long since been welded shut. They were close. Kalen could feel it. The memories came faster now, sharper and more vicious. He saw the flash of Enforcer armor in a darkened corridor. He heard the short, brutal burst of pulse rifle fire. He smelled the ozone and cooked metal. The final, terrible memory, the one he had walled off in the deepest part of his mind, broke through. He was on the floor of the bridge, his leg shattered by a plasma bolt. Yorick was trying to shield him, firing his sidearm at the black-helmeted figures advancing on them. A shot took Yorick in the chest. He fell back against Kalen, his weight a sudden, dead thing. His last words were a choked whisper. "Blue skies. Cap." Kalen came back to himself with a gasp, his whole body shaking. Ilara was there, her helmet pressed against his, her hand on his shoulder. She hadn't seen the memory, but she had felt its psychic blast, the explosion of pain and guilt. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He let the shared silence be its own comfort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached their destination, a heavy, circular maintenance hatch, its locking wheel frozen with rust. It took both their efforts, straining against the rusted metal until their muscles screamed, but with a final, groaning shriek, it gave way. They tumbled through the opening and onto a grated catwalk. The air was breathable, thin and stale, but it was air. They removed their helmets, the recycled hiss replaced by the low, mournful hum of a vast, empty space. They were standing on a gantry high above the floor of Docking Bay 7. The bay was a cavern of shadows, its main lights long dead, powered only by a few flickering emergency strobes. And there, in the center of the immense chamber, held in place by magnetic mooring clamps that glowed a faint, ghostly blue, was the stray dog. She was a skeleton, a husk. Large sections of her hull plating had been stripped away, revealing the superstructure and tangled conduits beneath. Her engines were cold and dark, her bridge a black, vacant eye staring into the darkness. She was covered in a decade's worth of red dust, a ship already buried in the rust of its own grave. It was worse than Kalen had imagined. It wasn't a ship. It was a tombstone. And standing before it, the sheer, crushing impossibility of their task settled over him like a funeral shroud. Despair has a sound. In the cavernous silence of Docking Bay 7, it was the faint, dry whisper of rust flaking from the stray dog's hull and drifting to the floor like red snow. Kalen stood on the gantry, the pulse rifle hanging forgotten in his hand, and felt a decade of carefully constructed numbness crumble. This wasn't just a ship, it was a monument to his dead. Every stripped panel, every severed conduit, was a fresh stab of guilt. He had led them in a charge for freedom and brought them here, to this cold, silent tomb. "It's impossible," he said, the words tasting like failure. "There's nothing left. They've picked it clean. The flight controls will be gone, the nav computer gutted, the life support. Even if we could power it up, it would just be a coffin." He expected agreement, perhaps even a shared sense of defeat from Ilara. Instead, Shashi stepped past him to the edge of the catwalk, her gaze fixed on the derelict with an unnerving intensity. "No," she said, her voice soft but certain. "They took its skin, they took its voice, but they didn't take its heart." She pointed toward the ship's heavily armored midsection. The reactor. I can feel it. The ethel they mined. So much of it passed through this bay, through this ship. It left an echo, a residue. The core isn't dead. It's sleeping. Kalen wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a psychic burnout, a desperate projection of hope onto a hopeless situation. But he knew the stray dog's design. She was built tough, a freighter designed for long, unsupported runs in hazardous space. Her reactor was a Class 4 fusion core, shielded by a meter of solid osmium alloy. It was too heavy, too integrated into the superstructure for scavengers to easily remove. They would have stripped everything around it. But the heart itself, it was possible. A flicker of the old captain, the engineer who knew his ship down to the last rivet, began to stir. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one they had. Even if the core is intact, he reasoned, his mind already cycling through 1,000 impossible variables. The ignition sequence requires a functioning bridge, an auxiliary power source, and a dozen system handshakes that no longer exist. Alara turned from the railing, her eyes clear and focused. Then you'll have to wake it up by hand. They descended a rusted service ladder to the docking bay floor, their boots crunching on a carpet of debris. The scale of the stray dog was immense up close, a wounded beast lying in state. They found an unsecured maintenance hatch near the primary landing gear, its locking mechanism long since busted by scavengers. Inside, the ship was a graveyard of severed wires and empty component racks. The air was cold and dead. Every corridor held a memory for Kalen. This was where Jorik had posted the crew's weekly poker tournament winners. That was the galley where they'd celebrated after clearing the Kessel Run with a record time. He moved through the ghosts of his past, his face a stony mask, forcing himself to see only the machine, not the home it had once been. They made their way to the engineering deck, a 2-level chamber at the heart of the ship. And there it was, the reactor housing, a massive, cylindrical monolith, was untouched, its osmium casing dull but unbreached. Around it, however, was chaos. The primary conduits had been severed, their thick copper innards spilling out like metallic entrails. The control consoles were dark, their screens smashed. "This is insane," Kalen muttered, running a hand over a dead terminal. "The pre-ignition sequence alone has over 200 safety protocols. I can't bypass them from here. I need a master console." "Use the one in your quarters," Ilara said simply. Kalen froze. "What? Your captain's console," Rushi clarified. "It has priority command access. It's not on the bridge. It's where you slept." Kalen stared at her. Scavengers would have hit the bridge first, then cargo, then engineering. A captain's personal quarters. It was low priority, likely overlooked. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. He led the way, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The corridor to the senior crew quarters was dark and narrow. The door to his old room was sealed. He used the rifle's butt to smash the lock and shoved it open. The room was just as he'd left it. A layer of red dust covered everything, but it was undisturbed. A single bunk, a small desk, and a built-in console. A data slate still sat on the desk, its screen dark. With trembling fingers, Kalen touched the console's activation pad. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a flicker, a single line of green text appeared on the screen. Auxiliary battery power 3.7%. It was a miracle. A ghost in the machine. He sank into the chair, his fingers flying over the keypad. Muscle memory from a past life taking over. He pulled up the engineering schematics, his mind racing. The main power conduits are severed, he said, more to himself than to Ilara. But there's a secondary line, an emergency coolant loop that runs directly from the reactor to the outer hull. It's small, not meant for this kind of load, but the scavengers might have missed it. If I can reroute the ignition charge through that loop and manually override the containment field regulators. He trailed off, the sheer number of ifs threatening to overwhelm him. Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder. Just tell me what you need me to do. The work was grueling. For the next several hours, the silent ship echoed with the sounds of their labor. Under Kalen's direction, they found a portable cutting torch in an emergency locker and used it to sever the emergency coolant pipe. He sent Ilara crawling into a cramped service duct with a spool of heavy-gauge wire he'd scavenged from a damaged cargo lifter, directing her to connect it to a specific junction box deep within the reactor housing. The only light they had was the beam from the pulse rifle, casting long, dancing shadows. As he worked on the console, trying to write a crude patch to bypass the safety protocols, his fingers brushed against the old data slate. On impulse, he powered it on. The screen flickered to life, displaying the last entry he had ever made the ship's log. The date was from the day of the mutiny. Log. Captain Kalen. His own voice. Younger and full of a confidence he no longer possessed, filled the small cabin. We're making our move tonight. Jorik has disabled the long-range comms. The crew is with us. The consortium thinks we're just another compliant freighter, another line item on their balance sheet. They're about to find out that the stray dog has teeth. Freedom isn't given, it's taken. This is for all the debt slaves, for all the ghosts in the Veil. Kalen out. He shut it off, his throat tight. He hadn't been taking freedom. He had been leading his friends to the slaughter. He looked at Ilara, who was watching him from across the room, her face smudged with grease. He was doing it again, leading another desperate soul on a fool's errand. The thought almost broke him. But then, a new sound intruded, a rhythmic, metallic clang echoing from the docking bay. Kalen froze, motioning for Ilara to be silent. He moved to the door and peered through the shattered lock. Far below, on the bay floor, the beams of several flashlights cut through the darkness. Sweep the area. A voice, amplified and chillingly familiar, boomed through the bay. Vorlag. The fugitives came this way. I can smell their pathetic hope. Find them. I want the null alive. The captain. You can be creative. The clock was no longer ticking. It was screaming. They're here. Kalen whispered, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. We have one chance. Now. He turned back to the console. The bypass was crude, unstable, but it was written. Ilara, get back to engineering. When I give the signal, you have to connect that wire. It's going to spark, and it's going to be loud. The moment you do, get behind the reactor housing. The magnetic field should offer some protection from their weapons. She nodded, her face pale but resolute, and slipped out of the room. Kalen took a deep breath. His hands hovered over the console. He opened a comms channel, not a radio frequency, but a simple, open audio feed piped through the ship's ancient internal speakers. Hey, Vorlag, he said, his voice echoing through the vast, dead ship. Looking for me. The flashlight beams on the floor below all snapped upward, trying to locate the source of the sound. So, the ghost of the stray dog speaks. Vorlag's voice boomed back, laced with sadistic amusement. Come out, Captain. Face your final judgment. I'm a little busy, Kalen replied, his fingers dancing across the keys. Waking up the dead, Ilara. Now, down in engineering. Ilara shoved the exposed end of the heavy-gauge wire against the contact point. A shower of brilliant blue sparks erupted, and a deep, resonant hum began to emanate from the reactor core, a sound that vibrated through the entire ship. On Kalen's console, a cascade of red warnings flashed across the screen. Containment field unstable. Magnetic bottle integrity at 23%. Catastrophic overload imminent. It was working. He initiated the final command, pouring the last of the auxiliary battery's power into the fusion igniter. The hum deepened into a groaning roar. The lights in his cabin flickered violently. The entire ship shuddered, a sleeping giant stirring in his tomb. Below, Vorlag and his men were momentarily stunned by the sound and the shaking deck. He's trying to overload the reactor, Vorlag yelled. Fall back, get to the blast doors. Kalen held his breath, his eyes glued to the screen. The reactor temperature was climbing past every red line. He had his hand on the manual release, a last-ditch purge that would vent the plasma into space or blow the entire bay to atoms. The ship screamed, a symphony of tortured metal and dying alarms. Then, just as the final overload warning began to shriek, a single light on the console flipped from red to a steady, solid green. Fusion sustained. Primary power online. The roars subsided, replaced by the strong, stable thrum of a living, breathing fusion reactor. The emergency strobes in the bay were instantly overpowered as the stray dog's external lights blazed to life, flooding the chamber with brilliant, defiant white light. Down on the floor, caught in the sudden glare, Vorlag and his enforcers froze like startled insects. The tomb was no longer a tomb. The ghost was awake, and it was furious. The light was a physical blow. For a decade, Docking Bay 7 had been the domain of shadows, but now it was scoured by the incandescent fury of the stray dog's newly awakened power. The ship's hull plates, where they remained, glowed with internal energy, and the magnetic mooring clamps sparked and smoked, struggling to hold the awakened beast down on the floor. Vorlag and his enforcers were silhouetted figures, their black armor rendered useless against the sheer, blinding glare. For a moment, no one moved. The universe held its breath, caught between the warden's brutal authority and the impossible, defiant roar of a ship that should have been dead. Then, Vorlag's training kicked in. His rage, cold and sharp, cut through his shock. It's a trap, he bellowed, his voice straining against the reactor's thrum. He's overloaded the core. It's going to blow, destroy the command deck now. The enforcer, their discipline restored by his command, raised their pulse rifles, but they didn't know where to fire. The sound was everywhere. The light was blinding. The ship itself had become the enemy. Up in his old cabin, Kalen watched the reactor status on his console. The core was stable, but everything connected to it was screaming in protest. Conduits designed for minimal power were now flooded with the full, raw output of a fusion reaction. He was riding a lightning bolt, and he had no reins. It's awake, he breathed, a giddy, terrifying laugh escaping his lips. The old girl is awake. But he knew this victory was measured in seconds. The ship couldn't move. The docking clamps held it fast. The bay doors were a wall of solid titanium, and the bridge controls were a dead man's dream. Alara appeared in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with the reflected light of the core. "They're going to try and board," she said, her voice steady. "I can feel their focus. They're looking for the heart of the ship, for us." Kalen looked from her to the console, then to the schematics still displayed on the screen. The plan that formed in his mind was not one of strategy or finesse. It was an act of pure, desperate violence, the only language the consortium understood. "We're not going to fly out of here," he said, a wild gleam in his eyes. "We're going to blast our way out." He pointed to the schematic. "The main drive engines are cold, but the plasma conduits are live. The magnetic containment is shot, but I can force the injectors open. It won't be a controlled burn. It'll be a plasma cannon, a single suicidal shot. It should be enough to atomize the bay doors." And he didn't add, possibly the front third of the ship along with them. "But I can't aim it from here," he continued. "The helm controls are on the bridge. They're dead." "No," Ilara countered, a strange new confidence in her voice. "They're not dead. They're just quiet. The ethel echo. It's not just in the reactor. It's in every system that handled the ore. The nav computer. The steering controls. The ship has a ghost. Kalen. And I think I can talk to it." It was the single most insane thing he had ever heard. It was also their only hope. "Go," he said, without a second's hesitation. "Get to the bridge. I'll handle the power. You be my eyes." She was gone in a flash, disappearing into the ship's newly illuminated but still dead corridors. Kalen turned back to the console, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He was no longer a mechanic. He was a composer, orchestrating a symphony of destruction with a broken instrument. He began to reroute power, shunting the entire output of the reactor not into the ship's systems, but directly into the primary plasma injectors of the aft engines. On the screen, every warning light he had bypassed earlier screamed back to life. Ilara reached the bridge. It was as Kalen had described, a dark, silent chamber that felt like a desecrated church. The main view screen was a black void. The command chairs were torn, and the consoles were dark and lifeless. But she wasn't seeing with her eyes. She closed them, reaching out with her mind, following the threads of energy that now pulsed through the ship. The beacon, the voice that had guided her from across the stars, was now inside the ship with her. It resonated in the old circuits, a memory of direction and purpose. She placed her hands on the cold, dead helm console. At first, nothing. Then, a faint blue light flickered deep within the smashed screen. It wasn't electricity. It was the soft, telltale glow of ethel. The ghost was listening. On the bay floor, the enforcers began their assault. They fired grappling lines that slammed into the stray dog's hull. They were climbing, their mag boots finding purchase on the skeletal frame. "Kalen, they're on the hull." Alara's voice, not spoken but felt, a clear, sharp thought in his mind. "Starboard side, near the forward cargo bay." Kalen's hands flew. He found the controls for the outer cargo bay doors and slammed them open, then shut. The massive, multi-ton doors scissored through the air, shearing two of the grappling lines and sending the enforcers attached to them tumbling into the darkness below. A small victory, but it bought them time. The ship groaned. the sound of a leviathan in its death throes. The conduits leading to the engines were beginning to glow. First a dull red, then a bright, angry orange, visible even through the hull plating. "The injectors are primed," Kalen sent back, his thought a ragged burst of frantic energy. "I need a firing solution straight ahead. Can you align us?" On the bridge, Alara gripped the helm, her knuckles white. She wasn't steering a ship. She was wrestling with its soul. She poured her will into the dead machine, her own psychic energy merging with the ethel echo on the view screen. A single wavering blue line appeared, a targeting reticle drawn by a ghost. It wavered, then steadied, pointing directly at the center of the massive bay doors. "We are aligned," she sent, the effort causing blood to trickle from her nose again. "Fire when ready." Vorlag, seeing his men thrown from the hull, knew he was out of time. He raised a heavy plasma cutter, a tool meant for breaching capital ship hulls, and aimed it at the base of the mooring clamp nearest to him. "Sever the clamps," he roared. "Let the reactor blow. We'll be clear." It was a final, spiteful act. If he couldn't have them, he would let the ship's own power become their tomb. Kalen saw the energy spike from the plasma cutter on a damaged control sensor. "He's cutting us loose. It's now or never." He slammed his palm down on the final command sequence. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, with a sound that was not a sound but a physical concussion that cracked the very floor of the docking bay, the stray dog's main engines fired. It was not the controlled, elegant burn of a starship drive. It was a raw, untamed spear of pure fusion plasma, a miniature sun erupting from the back of the ship. The mooring clamps, already weakened, vaporized. The back wall of the docking bay melted into slag, and the massive titanium doors, the final barrier between their cage and freedom, ceased to exist. They didn't explode. They were erased, turned into incandescent gas in less than a second. The stray dog, propelled by its own funeral pyre, shot forward. It was not flying. It was a cannonball fired from a broken gun. The ship screamed as it tore through its own cradle, shearing off entire sections of its remaining hull against the edges of the ruined bay opening. Alarms shrieked from Kalen's console as the ship began to tear itself apart. Vorlag, caught in the edge of the plasma wash, was not even granted the dignity of a scream. His armor, his body, his rage were simply unmade, reduced to atoms by the very power he had sought to contain. Then, they were out. They were in the veil. The ship tumbled through the toxic nebula, a burning, crippled wreck, trailing fire and debris. The engines sputtered and died, the single, violent burst having shattered them completely. A profound silence fell, broken only by the groan of stressed metal and the distant dying wail of the alarms on the rust. On the bridge, Alara collapsed, her connection to the ship severed. In his cabin, Kalen stared at the dead console, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. They were free. They were also dead in the water, in a crippled ship, in the most dangerous region of space known to man. He staggered to the bridge, helping Alara to her feet. They stood together before the main view screen, which now showed a swirling, chaotic vista of green and purple gas clouds. The stray dog was adrift. "You did it," Alara whispered, her voice filled with awe. "No," Kalen said, looking around at the bridge of his resurrected, dying ship. "We did it." He looked at her, The girl who spoke to ghosts and drew maps of the stars. We're free, but we're not going to last long out here. That little stunt shredded what was left of our power grid. Ilara smiled, a faint but genuine expression that transformed her gaunt face. The beacon is still there, she said. It's clearer now, without the station's interference. I know the way. She pointed a trembling finger toward a seemingly empty patch of the nebula. There, it's not a place. It's a rendezvous, a gathering. Kalen looked out at the impossible, beautiful, terrifying void. He had lost his ship once, and everyone on it. Now it had returned from the grave to give him a second chance. With a new crew of 2, the stray dog was a wreck, a ghost, a tombstone. He was now flying through the stars. But it was his tombstone, and for the first time in a decade, he felt the thrill of setting a course. All right, navigator, he said, a slow smile spreading across his own tired face. The ghost of the captain finally home. Take us there.